All right, everybody, welcome back to Pave the Way podcast. I'm here with Brian Murray, who is the author of one of my all-time favorite real estate books that I have listened to and read several times, and it will continue to be a book I will study as I gradually, look to get more into commercial properties. So, Brian, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It means a lot.
I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Greg.
Awesome, awesome. So if you guys and gals are not familiar with Brian, he wrote a successful book called Crushing It, which is really a paradigm shifting book on how, you could really start as an investor instead of going through the single family space and doing what I'm doing and flipping houses and wholesaling. Brian wrote a book on how you can actually start by jumping into commercial. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, commercial real estate, how Brian got into it, some successful deals he's done. So Brian, before we get into all that, would you mind giving the listeners a little bit about your background, how you what you did before you got into your first commercial deal?
Yeah, I tried a lot of different things before I got into commercial real estate. I got kind of a late start on that. So, I out of college, I worked as an engineer. After that, I went into the Peace Corps for a couple of years, came back, went to business school, worked as a management consultant, worked with an internet startup, walked away from that to become a teacher. And it was while I was teaching that I started investing in real estate.
That's awesome. So you were a teacher. So you were a professor, right? I believe.
Yeah, I taught marketing and entrepreneurship at the local community college, and I was finding it kind of hard to make ends meet with a teacher's salary, and realized that some of that cash that I'd managed to save up in my prior work was starting to dwindle away, and I got concerned, and I said, you know what, I maybe real estate's something that I could put that money to work for myself and make an extra income.
Awesome. No, that's awesome. I mean, so you had, you did the job thing, the 9 to 5, and I know that, you didn't just quit your job right away after you got into your first deal. We'll get into that. So my big question for you is, I'm sure the listeners are going to be, curious. What made you want to go from being a professor at a community college to getting involved in a massive commercial deal without starting with a wholesale deal or a fix and flip or doing a single family rental? What made you jump into commercial real estate out of all things?
Well, I when I got the idea to start investing in real estate, I wasn't thinking that big. I was looking at, hey, maybe I should get a single family home or a duplex or a triplex. And I kind of had that same mindset. I think that most people just feel like, hey, that's just the way you're supposed to start. Like if you want to get a rental property, you start small. And I started looking at properties. I would run the numbers. I started reading books and educating myself. And I noticed that the larger the property, the better the numbers seemed to be. And everything that I had read, everything I had heard said, well, it's not that much harder if you have 3 units versus 1 or 5 units. So I started to gradually look at larger and larger properties. And I remember it was a real turning point. I found a 21 unit that I put an offer in on. I convinced myself, hey, this is something I could actually pull off. Didn't come through. Just kept trying. And through that process, I started to understand that, hey, there were motivated sellers out there. There was one property that a broker brought to me and said, I know this is outside of your price range, but this is a really motivated seller. And, they're willing to help with owner financing. And there's other ways we could get you into this deal. And all of a sudden things became really real for me. Like, hey, I actually could pull this off. Now that property didn't work out, but I started to look at things with a new eye, and I didn't immediately rule out the big properties. So when a 50,000 square foot office building came my way and I started studying it, I just said, you know what, maybe this is something I could actually do. And the more I dug into it, the more I became convinced that there was a real opportunity there. I felt like the property had just been severely neglected and no one was paying attention or taking care of it. Found out that the seller had a mortgage that I was potentially able to assume. And now I realize, hey, that with that mortgage assumption, that's a path for me to own a much bigger property than I ever could have afforded without that.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's awesome. So it's just rare that a lot of new investors, especially if they're coming from a job where they're getting their consistent income checks, jump into a commercial property. It's not that common. So would you mind if we take a little bit more of a deep dive into this first deal you did? Because you shared it in the book, and I remember I read that chapter a couple times, and I was like, you talked about the deal, and I was like, wow. And then I heard you explain it on another podcast. So
Sure.
Overview on this building. I know you assumed the loan, which people aren't familiar with that. Basically, he got the bank who originally originated that loan to basically approve Brian basically step in the old buyer's shoes and then just keep making the mortgage payment. So how did you get into this deal, and then what did you do in terms of like, by the time you bought it to the time, I'm not sure if you still own it or not, but how did you add the value and make it a profitable deal for your company? And then maybe one or two good learning lessons that you got that the listeners can be like, wow, maybe I can do that in my town.
Yeah, absolutely. So the started off with a price, and I don't remember all the exact details, but I think we were initially at about 1.2 million, and started negotiating from there. And the seller said, well, one of the issues is I have this mortgage, and I have a really large prepayment penalty if I pay that mortgage off. So I can only go so low on the price, because once I hit that point, when I pay the mortgage off, I'm going to get hit with, it was about a $200,000 penalty.
Oh, wow.
Well, I came back and I said, well, what if, could we look into whether or not the mortgage is assumable? And in that case, would you reduce the price by the amount of the mortgage? And they agreed to do that. So I did take some risk, because in order to assume the mortgage, I had to front money to get environmental reports done, and all these tests done, and third-party reports that the bank required before they made a decision about the mortgage assumption. But I decided to go for it, and I was able to assume that mortgage and get into the property. There were other things that happened in addition to the discount that I got for assuming the mortgage. I also found out that the seller had fabricated some information along the way. And I went back to them, and faced with that information, they agreed to take additional funds off the price. So all in, we ended up closing at about $835,000. And I ended up having to come up with less than 10% of that out of pocket.
Wow. Because you assumed the mortgage, obviously, which was the
exactly. So that's how I got in. In terms of what made me confident that I could turn the property around, and how I did that. There were clear signs of neglect. The landscaping wasn't well tended. The building was all overgrown. I pretty soon discovered that the maintenance person who was working full time at the property really wasn't doing anything. He would disappear during the day, and we found out later he was going off to a woodworking shop he'd set up for himself out back, where he would refinish furniture. In the wintertime, the heat was on full blast, and when people got too hot, they just opened their windows, and in the summer, they'd crank up the AC, and when it was too cold, the tenants would open their windows, and there was no temperature control whatsoever. Everything ran on full blast 24/7. And literally just by programming the thermostat, we were able to cut the utility consumption in half. So there were a myriad of different things that anybody who paid close attention and walked through and really was common sense, but it was just nobody cared. Nobody was doing it. The owners were a long ways away outside of the area, never came to visit the site. They had a large portfolio of office buildings in that part of the northern New York, and this was the last one that they held, and they were just desperate to get rid of it. So I was glad to take it off their hands, and ready to try to make some changes for the better.
That's awesome. No, that is awesome. And it was a win-win, like every deal usually is. I mean, clearly, they neglected that one, and I'm sure you've heard of Jim Randall, Confessions of a Real Estate Entrepreneur. I think you mentioned that in your book, actually. So he talks about find properties with problems that are solvable, right? Like he calls, I think, artificially challenged properties. I think that's the exact definition he says. So you knew this deal from what you've explained so far was something, because you had the local, presence, you're not like some big corporation just looking at a balance sheet. You knew you could jump into this thing, assuming you're taking some risk, which you did, but you knew you could come in and turn, a lot of these problems were just from mismanaging. And it's not like it was like a terrible economy and there's no demand for office tenants, because I'm sure you did your homework before that. So you knew you could jump in there and, turn it around. So kind of coming out of this deal, what did you end up? I mean, you obviously you boosted the NOI up. I'm sure you filled up the building with some better tenants.
Yep.
What does that office building look like today? I'm not sure if you still own it or not, if you sold it.
Yeah, no, we still own that property today. So every year we do projects to make it better. We've invested a lot into it, and the tenants appreciate that. We're able to keep it full. It's well located. We take good care of it, and it generates good cash flow for us. But that was another key to our success. Is we really, to the point of being religious about trying to reinvest back into our properties. And that was sort of an irony of the whole motivation that I shared with you to get in. Was I wanted to get that extra cash flow, but once I started doing this, I couldn't get myself to pull any money out. So, I kept my job. Even as we grew our portfolio, every dime that we got from our real estate for many, many years went back into those properties to make them better, to boost the NOI. And that allowed us to not only increase the value of the properties and the cash flow, but also to refinance those properties and pull cash out and buy even more. So a lot of people were really surprised by how quickly I was able to grow the company, but you'd be surprised at what you can do if you're willing to really be good about reinvesting everything back in. And, I think that's true in any business, that if you're willing to invest back into the business, you can fuel a lot more growth.
Yeah, no, and a lot of people like to just pull out their money and go buy nice stuff. And I'm sure there's definitely a time and place to do that. But you knew that if you keep reinvesting that cash flow and the equity that you're pulling out, you'll be able to just really just turbocharge that business. So let's fast forward to where you're at today. I really appreciate you sharing that office building case study, because I remember reading that and I was just like, oh my goodness, that is incredible, because like between your book and Jim Randall's book, I've been like on the fence. I've been buying, selling a ton of residential property. And I'm like, I want to make that jump into commercial, and it's going to start with doing one deal and then eventually be able to go in there full time. So what does your business look like today? Like, I know that I think you've recently been focused more on apartments from what I've heard and studied about you, but what does your kind of overall business and portfolio look like today? Just so the listeners really know that you're a guy with a great amount of experience, and you haven't been doing this. I mean, you've been this for like 15 years, I believe. Like you started in like 2005 or 6, I think, right?
First started when I first started looking for that first property, it was 2006, and I closed in 2007. So I've been growing the business for about 12 years now. We have the bulk of our portfolio is still all within 30 to 45 minute drive of our main office. We're probably 2/3 to 3/4 apartments at this point. That has been our focus over the last few years in particular. And we've got about 600 or so apartments that we're operating in our market. And we've got a number of different office buildings and retail plazas as well. So we do all of our own property management. I've got about 24 folks right now who take care of all aspects of managing the company. And over this past year, I've made a complete change in focus. So all the things that were successful that got me started, I'm having fun, experiencing, going in a different direction and trying new things. So I've been establishing partnerships with other investors, which I hadn't done in the past. I've been acquiring properties in other parts of the country, and getting involved in some syndications and raising money, and having a lot of fun learning about different ways of doing things, and meeting a lot of great new people. And so that's been a lot of fun. A big change, but now we're growing in another area.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So, now you're getting into some new stuff and buying. So mostly your properties are in that upstate, northern New York area, Watertown. Now you're buying out of state. So my question to you is, before you made your pivot recently,
Yep.
were you doing any syndication on these bigger deals, or were you funding all these quote unquote in-house without bringing in outside investors?
Never raised money before, never brought in another investor or partner. We, started right in the beginning from that first property, just focused on driving NOI, and the access to cash would come from cash flow from the properties, but more so from the cash out refinancing of the properties once we increased their value. So every time we did that, those funds were then reinvested in additional properties, and that continued for all the way up until this past year. And it in order to try to continue the growth rate that we had achieved, it's becoming more challenging as we got larger, because it's more and more cash intensive, becoming more and more challenging to find as much value add and as great a deals as we found in the past. And frankly, for those 12 years, I've been perpetually cash poor, as the business has, because every time there's enough money to manage to buy another property, that's what we've been doing. And so there's this major constraint on trying to continue that growth, and that is not enough cash. So we reached a point where we said, hey, let's go out and try some new things. Let's work with other real estate entrepreneurs who are going out and finding these great deals in throughout the country, and making opportunities for limited partners to come in and earn returns. And so that opportunity sounded very appealing to me, and I've met a lot of great people out there, and partnering up, and it's been a lot of fun so far.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And I like how you started, with your own backyard. And a lot of folks I listen to and I speak to, they say, if you can, stay in your own backyard to begin, because like you have that, and you mentioned this in your book, you have that local advantage. Like, I think the subtitle of your book is How a Small Investor Can Make It Big, right? Yeah. The whole theme is like, you don't have to be this big, institution to be successful in commercial. So, besides the fact that obviously there's more control when you're in your market, what was like one other reason why you decided to stay local for the first really 10 to 12 years of your career? And how did that really give you an advantage besides the obvious reasons?
Well, there are so many advantages that gives you. I mean, first off, no one will ever take care of a property the way the owner will. And in fact, it became very evident, because the greatest value add opportunities that I would find were properties that were owned by somebody who was not local, wasn't keeping track of where market rents were, what was going on. And, you can easily dramatically increase the value of a property if someone hasn't been keeping up with market rents, where you step right in and say, hey, as soon as you take over the property, you can begin to boost the rents to where they should be. And I found the reverse true as well. We just, not that long ago, purchased a large multifamily property where that property owner was not in touch with local rents, and they were charging way too much rent. And so what did we do? The first thing, we came in and we lowered all the rents. And so having that local knowledge and being in tune with what's going on, being familiar with the submarkets, because in a given city, it might look like an attractive city, but there can be pockets that are really bad. And the reverse is true too. You might have a city that overall might not look that great, but there are parts of it that are fantastic. So you really have all this knowledge. And then once you start buying those properties locally, you can have great efficiencies of scale too. So, I've got a team that I mentioned, and that team gets shared among about 30 or so properties right now. So it's very efficient, because we can share all of our resources. We can work with the same contractors. We can negotiate deals in bulk. So if I want to go out, for instance, and hire somebody to do snow removal, we can put a dozen or more properties in front of them and say, what kind of quote can you give us on the whole thing? So lots of different advantages. And frankly, the number one thing for me was I had too much at stake to let anybody else do it. I put all of my savings in. I cashed out my retirement account. I rolled the dice and I said, I'm going to make this work. Of course, I say roll the dice, but I wanted it to be within my control as much as I could. And I was confident that if I did it myself, I could make sure that it got done right. Knew I'd make mistakes, but I also knew I could fix them and I'd learn from them. Yeah, if you're going to take a risk and put that much money in, that was a ton of money for me at the time. I think it would be for most people. And I just said, there are a lot of things I don't know, but I can figure them out. And I'm going to do as much of this as myself as I can to save as much money as I can.
That's awesome. No, I think that was some great tips for everyone. So I appreciate that. And my follow-up question on that, as we start to wrap the show up and get towards the end here, you mentioned when we started talking about your current business today that you're primarily like 75% focused right now on the apartment building niche. And, there's all the different niches in commercial, retail, office, industrial. So what is making you so bullish on the apartment? Like, or really a better question would be, why apartments? I mean, what is so attractive for the apartments? Because a lot of people nowadays are talking about apartment buildings. They really love them. They get a little skeptical about some of the office and maybe retail. Oh, retail's dead. They drive down the street and there's all these vacant plazas. So like on one hand, I'm thinking, well, yeah, that makes sense. Everyone needs a place to live. But then on the other hand, I'm thinking, well, everyone might want to be getting into apartments. So maybe that's driving down cap rates. Maybe it's making it more competitive. I mean, I don't own any apartment buildings right now, but that's kind of what I'm looking at from like an outsider's perspective.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of things I like about apartments. I mean, one of the big things is that when you compare and contrast it to commercial properties, a lot of your commercial properties are dependent on one tenant for a large portion of the rent. Like we really try to find properties that was not the case, where you have as many, multi-tenanted properties so that you don't get slammed if you lose somebody. But it's happened to us numerous times. You'll have somebody, a tenant that occupies 40-50% of a plaza, and that tenant leaves and you're immediately, bleeding cash. That doesn't usually happen with apartments. You have a little more control. So if you have a fluctuation in the market and you have a drop in occupancy, that the market will usually respond to tweaking rents, putting a concession out there. And so I feel like you've got a little bit more control. Prefer to work with the apartment tenants over the commercial tenants. That's just a personal preference based on our experience. But I 100% agree with the concerns that you're sharing. Valuations are super rich right now. Cap rates are at historic all-time lows. Yeah. And there is no doubt that there is a lot of risk. And so we are very careful to try to find properties that have enough value add that we're comfortable. It's not easy right now. And in fact, my latest venture, which is just getting underway, is with mobile home parks. I've actually teamed up with Brandon Turner from Bigger Pockets, and we're launching a mobile home park fund. And I'm really excited about that because I actually think that mobile home parks are far more what we call, recession resistant. And when you're dealing with apartments and the economy goes south, you have people moving to maybe from an A class to a B to a C, and you get some rent compression. But with mobile home parks, I kind of equate them to sort of like in the retail space, it's the dollar store. In a dollar store, sales will actually go up when you're in a recession. And so it's the same type of thing. When there's always going to be a need for affordable housing. And so when you're dealing with mobile home parks, I mean, that's the most economical, option for actually owning your own residence. And so I feel a lot more confident with that. The cap rates are a couple points higher than apartments as a whole. So you get better returns and you've got more cushion there. So really excited about that opportunity. We've got quite a few home parks under contract already. And that's something, an area that's we're really excited to be doing.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I'm sure you've heard of a gentleman named Kevin Bupp, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. I had him on the show. We did a whole show on mobile home parks, and it was awesome. A really good guy. So definitely a cool little niche there. And it seems to me like, I think what he said, like they're not going to build any more mobile home parks. So there's already like they're already kind of there, and there's really not a lot of incentive for developers to build new ones. A lot of towns don't like them, so like you have that demand there already. So that's awesome. That's really awesome. So as we start to wrap the show up, Brian, this has been super awesome to have you on. What would you say is your best advice for someone who is, maybe they're in the single family space right now, they're in residential real estate, and they want to make that jump to commercial, but they just maybe it's a mindset thing, maybe it's a technical thing. What would be your best brief advice for them, like on why they should consider going bigger instead of trying to get more single family rentals or flip more houses? Because it's almost like that's kind of where I'm at. I'm doing like 3 to 5 properties a month. It's good. I'm enjoying it. I'm growing, but I really know that the long-term wealth is in the commercial. And I just feel like it's so different. And I'm like, oh my God, there's so much more money and deals. And what's your best advice for them? Because I bet you a lot of people are probably thinking this as they're listening.
Well, first off, I would say there's a lot of ways to make money in real estate, and I'm definitely not gonna sit here and say that one way is better than another. But what I do want to say is that if what's holding you back is that you don't think you can do it, then I don't believe that.
Yeah.
If I can do it, you can do it. Your listeners can do it. If you're motivated enough and you're willing to work hard enough, and you're careful and diligent in finding the right deal, you can make it work. So if you find better deals with smaller properties, and that's how you prefer to get started, and you're more comfortable with that, that's fine. I think that anybody who does that, that's fantastic, because the hardest thing is to take action and to get out there and buy that first property. So, if a really large property isn't right for you, that's okay too. But if you're saying, well, I really would rather go large, but I don't think it's possible, I don't think I can do it, I would challenge you on that and say, I don't think that's true. So you got to decide what's right for you, but don't let fear hold you back.
I love it. Feel the fear and do it anyway. One of my favorite books. Read it a few times. So awesome, Brian. Well, before we let you go here, is there one book that you have read that has really made an impact in your life, whether it's a business book or a personal development book that the listeners, do you think you get some value from?
I read a ton of books. My favorite changes depending on which one I've read most
Yeah,
recently,
right.
probably. One that pops to mind that I was just talking about somebody about it recently is "The Obstacle Is the Way" by Ryan Holiday. I think that's a fantastic book, and I think anybody that's going to achieve success is going to face a lot of setbacks and a lot of obstacles. And that book does a great job of talking to you about, how you can use those to your advantage to grow and achieve your goals. So, shout out to The Obstacle Is the Way.
That's a great book. I love that. I have a couple copies of that one. People have sent me that. It's a good gift book. So
Yeah,
awesome.
absolutely.
Awesome. So for all the listeners, if you guys and girls have not heard of Brian's book, it's called Crushing It. It's available on Amazon. I recommend, if you want to get into commercial real estate, this is a really great, just hands-on book, tactical, tells a lot of good stories, a lot of case studies in there. So I'll put a link to the book in the show notes. Brian, if people wanted to reach out to you, maybe connect with you and find out more about this mobile home park fund or anything else you have going on, what would be the best way for them to reach you or your company?
Yeah, your listeners can feel free to reach out to me on social media. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Facebook. Recently set up an Instagram account. It's at Crushing It Brian. So, any of those platforms you can reach me. And my website address for my company is WashingtonStreetProperties.com.
Awesome. Brian, thank you so much for being a guest on the show. I really appreciate this. And this is going to be a popular one, I can tell. And I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Greg. Enjoyed our conversation.